Since the earliest of civilizations, we have made much progress, but that progress came with a cost. Our world has changed.
One sequel that I've waited longer than I think for any other game to come out, to be announced, to be presented, is, and it's not even called that, but to me, this game is Alpha Centauri 2, Sid Meier's Civilization Beyond Earth. Really, this sort of the next step after the space race win. Is that how you think of it? That this is what happens after the space race win?
I think it's us looking at civilization, you leading your civilization through the ages, but now we're going into the future. So what happens if Earth, if we ever leave Earth, if we go to another planet, we would still have challenges to overcome, and how would we deal with it as humanity, as a civilization? So going those next steps into an unknown future, that was the idea. And of course, there's a lot of parallels with Alpha Centauri. The setting is very similar. I do think it's its own game in some respects. It's different in some respects than Alpha Centauri. It just is a civilization game at its core. So yeah, leading yourself into the future was kind of the spark where we started.
Yeah, because I felt like Alpha Centauri had its own sort of take on the civilization. It wasn't just civilization in space. It had that sort of that narrative that went through the game. It's sort of a very, very deep narrative. And now you're also changing the sort of the storytelling a little bit with the missions and that sort of thing. Can you tell us a little bit how that compares to playing Civilization 5?
Right. Yeah, there's definitely some differences. So Civilization 5 being set in history, the player automatically has a framework of narrative. So in Civilization, we do want the player to tell their own story, always. They are the huge, they are the writer of their history. So they do have the framework. Going into the future, there isn't really a framework. So we had to provide some kind of framework. So we do that by providing characters, the individuals leading those expeditions are important. We provide background story of what happened on Earth in the meantime, like what groupings formed in the meantime, who's leaving Earth now. And then the quest system, for example, is really important because it gives you snippets and insights into what is this planet we landed on? Like what kind of environment is waiting for us? Those aliens, why are they reacting in the way they do? And the resources that you haven't found on Earth before. So what's going on with this planet? This narrative is really important because we, again, want the player to tell their story. But in the future, I mean, if you look at the tech web, it becomes more and more fantastical the further you go outside of the center because it's an unknown future. We're kind of making stuff up to the outside. We start in a plausible way and we want the path to be plausible. But on the outsides, who knows? It's the future. Anything could happen. So going out there, providing a framework for players to tell their story. And I think the story will differ quite dramatically every playthrough because you can pick certain paths and they can be very different. Your approach to the future of mankind will not be the same every time you play. I'm pretty sure about that.
That's an interesting thing that you say, that different path thing, because you're doing the tech tree a little bit differently than you usually do. Usually it's like it's a tech tree, but probably you'll advance through everything and you'll sort of unlock everything, and that doesn't really of course what order you do things sort of has an impact on the sort of victory condition that you're going for, but this time around you're structuring it a little bit differently. Can you explain how that will work?
Yes. So yeah, you're right. The history of mankind, the history of research is known, so it's linear in the end. It gives you momentary advantages to go one first, but in the end it's linear. In Beyond Earth we have a web. You start in the middle. You start by just finding out pioneering on this planet. How can I form a colony? What do I need to know for that? Then the few texts around that are very basic and still very normal to us, like physics and ecology, like very known concepts to us as humanity. And then you move out further, and then it comes robotics and, you know, gene splicing, and it becomes just more out there. And the goal the designers had was to always stay plausible from one step to the next. And you always say, like, yeah, when I have robotics, that next step makes sense. But to get to a point where obviously, you know, the units and the leaders start looking different than how we define humans today, because humanity will probably have to change to overcome the challenges they face on a completely different world. So yeah, basically starting in the middle, it's a web in all directions, and you choose which path to go.
Very interesting. Another thing that I thought about is how you're treating factions. As far as I understand it, maybe I'm wrong about this, but they can drop in at any point during the game, so it's not like everyone sets up base in the beginning and sort of spreads out from there. Things can change sort of dynamically during a playthrough.
So the player starts first on the first turn, and then the other factions just arrive after the player, usually up to 50 turns, sometime in the first 50 turns. They do come later, they do have some advantages, because, you know, they picked a slower engine, but they had more cargo room, or, you know, like slow but stronger engine. So they bring some extra stuff to help them along, but they drop in later, and so that changes dynamics a bit. So you might have seen a bit more of the planet before they even land, might give you some tactical advantages. Another faction, in a way, not a playable faction, but another faction, is the planet itself. The planet, obviously you arrive there, it's not your planet, it's not your home world. You arrive and you set up there, and there are life forms. They're not sentient beings, but they are life forms, and they start pushing back if you're too aggressive. If you're expanding a lot, they will start pushing back and just trying to get you off their planet. And yeah, and they act very, like, they act together. If you start attacking them a lot, they get roiled up and they will start coming for you.
So not at all like barbarians. It's a very different kind of sort of,
it feels very different, because they come after you. Like, once it's become clear that you mean them harm, they will come after you, and they have huge units that you are no match for in the beginning. The siege worm is one example. It's just a huge unit, huge worm burrowing through the ground. It'll destroy all improvements if it moves through your territory, and the first few Marines you have with you on the planet are just no match at all. So it'll take a few unit upgrades, and it'll take maybe some ranged units and a few melee units to take that thing down in the beginning. So poking at them too early is kind of risky.
All right, so maybe that sort of ruins some of the strategies I've been playing at Civ, sort of, but also the fact that factions come in later, it sort of means that there's a little bit more of a, that it's not as predictable to start. It's not about grabbing the sort of the key points on the map. It's not as clear cut perhaps in the early game.
Yeah, I think especially the first 50, 100 turns are a lot about survival. It's not so much about grabbing land, because you need to survive first. This planet is hostile. There's miasma, it's like a floating gas that harms your units. You need to research it first before you can adapt to it a bit. If you choose the harmony path, for example, you adapt to it and it doesn't harm you anymore. But the planet has its challenges, and you know, you just made it off Earth with this ship, and you touch down on this planet, and the ship and what you brought is all you have, and somehow you need to make sure your civilization survives. So that's the challenge at the beginning. It's not really about diplomacy in the early game, or about, you know, like grabbing all the land. Not yet. Later in the game, that totally becomes a thing. But
so how are you treating multiplayer in that sense? Is it a similar approach where you can choose to drop in the first round and then drop later with more supplies, or how do you treat that?
So we're still working on multiplayer. It's not totally pinned down yet. We are approaching in the way that the player should drop the first turn, usually, for multiplayer. yeah.
It's hard to balance it otherwise, perhaps.
It's really tricky. For a single player game where it's about the narrative as well that the player experiences, having those drop in fits really well. In multiplayer is just different in a lot of ways. Less about the narrative. For the normal multiplayer gamer, they will not go for the nice narrative, you know. And a lot of multiplayer games in Civilization end in the domination victory and not necessarily the science or culture victory. So yeah, it's a different game, I guess, in a way. You play it differently.
Right, and it's set for October release, that correct?
Fall 2014.
All right.
The date and month are not quite set yet.
All right. Looking forward to it very much. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.